These are the Doukhobors. They are a sect of loosely Orthodox Christians from Russia and the Ukraine. You're probably wondering why they're stripping naked and terrorizing villages across Canada. Long story short, they had their children stolen by the RCMP, they were used and abused by the Canadian government, and if that's all you need to know, there's your story. If you're still along for the ride, let's dive in. The Doukhobors suddenly appeared out of the Orthodox Christian faith in the Ukraine after a schism ruptured the Russian Orthodox Church. This great split, called the Rashkol, was caused by a fingering decision. To be more specific, whether or not to use 2 or 3 fingers when you sign the cross on your body. The Doukhobors, meaning spirit wrestlers, originally were branded as fighters against the Holy Spirit as a joke against their opposition to this reform. In a surprise twist of events, because of this opposition to reform, they would go on to make their own version of a very liberal Orthodox Christianity bordering on communism, ending up being the true reformers in the end. They didn't want mass or crosses, or fasting or holidays, or even churches. Heck, that whole Bible book? Just get rid of it. Plus, reading was a trap that led you away from God, so they would enforce and extol the virtue of illiteracy. Songs in the form of psalms and lamentations are not only tolerated, but encouraged and often sung. However, musical instruments are the work of the devil and are to be shunned. Vegetarianism and abstinence from alcohol eventually made its way into their tenets as their policy for non-violence grew stronger and stronger. To them, the true signs of a Christian was a loaf of bread, a bunch of salt, and a jug of water. The priesthood was abolished. Every man now imbued the spirit of Christ within them and could talk to the divine. Their popularity would quickly grow in the late 1700s as Russia pushed itself into European wars and politics. The Doukhobors would take after the Quakers and shun war altogether, famously burning their firearms and paying for it at the hands of the Imperial Russian Cossack gendarme. Many were exiled to Siberia and spread the faith further and further, leading to mass conversions that could not be ignored. Under the reign of Alexander I, he provided them land near the Mennonites in the Crimea to sow their seed and live relatively undisturbed. They thrived, making livable land out of swamps and marshes, which was very convenient when Nicholas I, Alexander's successor, took the throne. He pushed out the Doukhobors into the Caucasus, where they would work their magic once again, and generally be out of the way when he wanted to expand into the Ukraine. This is where Peter Verigin, or as he would be called, Peter the Lordly, would come into the picture. Peter would be schooled as a leader in the Doukhobor sect and soon take control of the largest group. When the Russians came to conscript him and a group of men into the army, they refused and burned their arms instead. So the Doukhobors would be exiled again because of this act. This time it would be a split, some to Arkhangelsk and some to Georgia. But this did little to turn them into what was considered a model Russian. However, this did get the attention of Leo Tolstoy, a very wealthy Russian author. For those who don't know much about Tolstoy, he came from an old Russian noble family, and he made his real wealth writing books and plays. By the time he met the Doukhobors, he was very famous and well established as an author, and had been following peasant culture in Russia for a while. Being somewhat of an anarchist, Tolstoy was drawn to the Doukhobors' way of life and desperately wanted to see them find a place to put down their roots. Then, Prince Dmitry Kilkov, who was another Russian noble, stayed with the Doukhobors during the Russian-Turkish War, and found their way of life quite suited him. Together with Tolstoy and a few other pacifists, they spread the news of the Doukhobors' plight. Their call to action spread far and wide, and finally landed in the hands of Tsar Nicholas II's mother, the Dowager Empress Maria. She was instrumental in getting them both funding and the rights they had been asking for since Alexander I. And with funding came the idea of leaving Russia altogether, avoiding the cruel monarch that was ready to oppress them and use them whenever they saw fit. Places like Brazil, China, Hawaii, and Texas were all mentioned, but the British Foreign Office had eyes out for hard-working laborers that could terraform their colonies. And so the Doukhobors would be sent to the newly acquired colony of Cyprus with London's blessing. They once again started fresh, building something out of nothing, except this time with blisteringly hot weather and pretty angry locals. Cyprus wasn't for them, so a plea once again went out to the British for some kind of land they could colonize. The British would come back to them with the perfect location. Ukrainians and Russians had been settling the Canadian prairies since the mid-19th century, and still to this day make up a large portion of the peoples living in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So when the Doukhobors showed up, it was almost a match made in heaven. Almost. Their arrival signaled a new peoples in the West, a peoples that would work for pennies on the dollar, and shun the way of life of most of the Catholic communities they had walked into. The wages around Winnipeg plummeted. The hate started to grow for these new immigrants. But regardless of what the general populace thought of them, by 1900, the Doukhobors had spread from Manitoba to BC, sowing their crops and building their communal lodgings, all while keeping to themselves as they didn't speak any English and didn't enjoy the power the Christians had over the West. Their charismatic leader, Peter Vernonen, would join the colony at Yorktown, Saskatchewan in 1902 and immediately begin denigrating the Doukhobors that didn't align with his views. Soon, a new town would be built called Vernonen, and a CN rail line would connect it to the outside world. Peter would also form the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood to not only separate his followers from the rest of the Doukhobors, but also to gain the favor of the mostly English West. Although, I'm not sure favor was what he was looking for. From 1902 to 1905, the Doukhobors under Peter the Lordly would clash with every single person they came into contact with. He would cut off all goodwill and ties with Tolstoy and leave some of his family in Russia. That's why, in 1905, when the Dominion Land Office of Canada came to the various communities asking who owned the land they worked, a disagreement ensued. Land to the Doukhobors was communal, so no man could own it themselves. And that wasn't the answer the land office wanted. Eventually, Peter would come to terms with the government, and this would lead to a fracture in the fragile 3-year peace within the Doukhobors. The Svobodniki, either called the Freedomites or the Sons of Freedom, were totally against Peter Vernogen's concessions to the Canadian government. Approximately 52 men and women marched from village to village, freeing beasts of burden and creating quite the ruckus, all in the name of advertising a return to the anarchistic ways of the past. When the Northwest Mounted Police heard of the Freedomite convoy, they stopped them in their tracks on the way to Yorktown. So what do you do when you're a pacifistic anarchist sect of Christians and there are men with truncheons blocking your way? Well, you take your clothes off. Yes, the solution was to get naked and hope that the shock would allow them to pass into Yorktown to scold every person. That didn't work, and the Freedomites were either arrested or clothed and turned away. This was the first mass nudity and first mass protest that the Sons of Freedom would later become famous for. The Freedomites would eventually retire back to the other Doukhobor colonies, and life would return to relative normality. They begrudgingly accepted taxation, public works like roads and rail, and even let the census come through town. I'll bet most of the information given was falsified. But the government would come calling once again, and this time with a much larger ask. Saskatchewan had just been officially created in 1905, and the idea of establishing school districts was being tossed around. To the notorious illiterate anti-school Doukhobors, this was too much. The neighboring Quakers would teach their children to read, write, and speak English, all while giving them lessons from the Bible, and they were even asking the colonies to pledge allegiance to the British Crown. This was Tsarist Russia all over again. So when the settlers from Ontario squatted on Doukhobor land, with the government turning a blind eye, enough was enough. In 1908, after another Freedomite protest in Yorktown, Peter the Lordly picked up the colony and moved everyone to BC. The new colony in British Columbia would be built around Brilliant, Castlegar, and Grand Forks. On top of the land they owned in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, the commune was taking on quite a bit of debt. Thankfully, the temperate BC weather allowed them to grow orchards and manufacture honey. Unfortunately, they needed money to stay free, so Peter established the Kootenai Columbia brand of jams, or KC brands for short. It was an immediate success, selling out in stores across Canada, and life was once again good. Even during World War I, despite the shortage of salt and foodstuffs, the Doukhobors made do. and they were not expected to carry out military service. Once again, the issue of educating their children came to a head. In 1921, after a disastrous year for crops and the government breathing down their necks, Peter the Lordly bought land in Oregon and wanted to move the families to his new American colony. To prepare for the move, the Doukhobors took their children out of the school they had built in Brilliant, and by 1922, the police caught wind of their absence, and of course fined the colony, taking some of their supplies as payment. I'm not sure what the police expected, but this is what they got. They burnt the schoolhouse to the ground, but it didn't stop there. By 1923, 9 more schools around the Brilliant Castlegar area were also torched. When the cops approached Peter for answers, he told them of the Sons of Freedom, and of course their naked protests. The Northwest Mounted Police were originally pretty hesitant to believe him. However, they later would, as Peter's house was one of the targets, and it would go up alongside the community sawmill. By 1925, the remains of the last school had smoldered out, and no culprit was being brought forward. The men of the now BC Provincial Police asked one more time, "Will you take your children to school?" A resounding "niet" was heard from the colony. So under the authority of the province of BC and the government of Canada, the police invaded the colony at Grand Forks and confiscated everything. Lumber, foodstuffs, machines, equipment, all were sold to pay the fines they levied on the parents for not sending their children to school. The Doukhobors looked to their leader, Peter Verrigan the Lordly, but he was nowhere to be found. Later they would learn that Peter had died along with 8 other people on October 29, 1924. The train car he was traveling in suddenly exploded when traveling between Brilliant and Grand Forks. The cause? Intentional detonation of dynamite. The suspect? Well, his enemies were too long to list. The Sons of Freedom would obviously have an MO, as they were almost fanatical about fire and dynamite. But the Doukhobors that followed Peter believed it was actually the Canadian government trying to rid themselves of the Doukhobor nuisance. A culprit would never be found, and the case would be closed. Peter Verrigan would be the last true communal leader of this odd sect of pseudo-Christians. His son, also Peter Verrigan, would adopt a more Canadian way of life, despite living in what was then the USSR. He'd be known as Peter the Purger, as he drunkenly clashed with the remaining Doukhobors. Most would leave his colony and purchase land in Alberta to found the town of Arrowwood. Peter the Purger would assure the government of Canada and BC that the colonies under his control would follow not only the law, but also would make their children go to school. However, despite their best efforts, the debt load and mismanagement of the colony's companies became too heavy to deal with. By 1938, a fire sale of property, equipment, goods, and machinery from colonies across Canada was made public and divided up piecemeal. Sun Life Financial began evicting Doukhobor tenants from their land in order to put it up for sale. To top it all off, Peter the Purger had died in the hospital and World War II was about to kick off. The Sons of Freedom were gaining steam within their communities, and a call to return to the simpler way of life was put out. If the Freedomites had to burn everyone's property down to force them to go back to a humble existence, they would. Public property was also in their sights. Huge leaps forward in transportation, communication, and utilities had been made since they emigrated in 1902, and this was problematic to the Freedomites. They began conducting what they termed black work, using farming dynamite to take down telecommunications and power lines, roads and rails, and everything else in their path. The beloved jam factory in Brilliant, the cog that had kept the Doukhobors going, was also burned down in 1943 in an almost symbolic gesture. There was no turning back now. On top of the new demonstration in Vancouver's Stanley Park, non-Freedomite Doukhobor homes in Brilliant, Crestova, Gilpin, and Appledale were all torched. The RCMP began arresting the Freedomites and sending their children into provincial-run orphanage schools, not unlike those of the residential schools First Nations children were forced into. Unfortunately, it was no use. The bombings and arsons would continue. In 1947, a bridge linking Castlegar and Brilliant was dynamited to the point of collapse, and once again, a group of naked men paraded through Brilliant's downtown in defiance. In 1953, the BC and Alberta RCMP came up with a plan, Operation Snatch. After years of telling them to get their kids educated to deaf ears, the RCMP began rounding up children and placing them in the New Denver prison dormitory. The New Denver prison had been a Japanese World War II internment camp and was now repurposed to keep the Doukhobor children in and their parents out. In 1955, the RCMP fell upon the community of Kristova in the early hours of the morning and would conduct the largest raid of a Freedomite camp in history. 70 officers stole 40 children from their parents and drugged them kicking and screaming into captivity. When asked by the news whether or not the claims of brainwashing were true, an inspector at the school, Nelson Allen, is quoted as saying, "When the children leave after 8 years, they will no longer be the sons of freedom. They will be Canadians." So to the common Canadian, and even some of the other sects of Doukhobors, this was a no-brainer. The Sons of Freedom were causing havoc all across BC, and the only way to stop it was to take the freedom out of the sun. However, despite the dwindling numbers, despite the indoctrination, despite the overwhelming criminal charges and fines, the Freedomites kept fighting. In 1954, an investigator for Canadian Pacific Rail had estimated the damage to their infrastructure to total over $15 million. In 1961, another bridge was blown up in Nelson, and a railway office in Vernon almost was blown apart. In 1962, 3 villages of independent Doukhobors were completely destroyed, including their automobiles, stores, and equipment. Post offices were receiving mail bombs, RCMP were being shot at, and car bombs were leveling neighborhoods, both purposefully and accidentally. 70-year-old women were being left without homes, 20-year-old men were being left without arms after accidental detonations, and countless Freedomites were being committed to mental asylums thanks to their ritualistic nudity. The ones who weren't being institutionalized were being convicted and sent to prison. The BC government went out of its way to build a special fireproof prison just for Freedomites called Mountain Prison, now Mountain Institution. Dozens of prisoners were huddled together with nothing to do other than to serve time. If they stripped naked, it would be for themselves, and if they tried to go on hunger strike, they would be force-fed or left to die. From the 1970s onwards, the steam seemed to run out of the Freedomite movement. This was attributed to John J. Varigan, Peter the Purger's son, and he would receive the Order of British Columbia for it. The RCMP would try to arrest him in 1979 on suspicion to commit arson, tapping his phone and stalking him, but the charges didn't stick. Their height of 7,000 members had long since passed thanks to death, imprisonment, and indoctrination. Since coming to Canada, they had picked up and started over so many times, you couldn't count it on your hands. They had been swindled, cheated, used and abused. Canada turned out to be exactly like Russia in the end, using them as terraformers to tame the wilderness of the West, only to be removed to make way for more desirable colonists. And while I tried to get a complete picture of this sect, I skipped over many things for the sake of time. From Frank Oliver breaking treaties, to swindlers stealing their money, to softer, independent chapters that helped make the prairies what they are today, Western Canada owes quite a lot to these intrepid Russian farmers. Approximately 20,000 Doukhobors still exist to this day, but very few resemble their ancestors. As of 2022, the children of New Denver Prison never received their apology. They were just innocent bait to bring the guilty out. Thanks for watching.